So I was thinking through numerous ways to start this event, and there were numerous opening marks I could kind of make along different sorts of valences, and I decided against a lot of them. A lot of them kind of had to deal with repeating in some way many of the many memorials that came out last August, whether that's Tom Gunning's official obituary for Hannah that he wrote for the SCMS newsletter, or whether that's many of the outpourings of remembrances that came out through social media and the things like that. But I decided that I actually didn't want to start with that note. We're going to have a long Q&A and roundtable discussion at the end, plenty of chance for remembrances along those lines. But I didn't really want to start by framing things in that way, because this event is billed as a celebration and kind of a continuation of scholarship that was begun by Hannah Frank. So I didn't want to start things on a note of, I wanted to start things on a note of remembrance, but not necessarily a note of mourning, but instead a note of future possibilities. So I'm just going to say that and leave it at that, and we can have more openness for other types of reflections as the event continues. We've organized this in such a way that we track Hannah's academic career, so it begins at Yale University, moves on to University of Iowa, where she got her master's, then moves on to University of Chicago, where she got her PhD, finally goes to, University of North Carolina, Wilmington, where she worked last year, before ending with kind of a celebration of the different branches of animation studies that exist today, a younger contingent, kind of her own cohort of animation scholars, and then finally a senior representative of the field. Beginning right off the bat, we actually have a change to make to the program. Unfortunately, John McKay is not able to make it to SCMS due to health issues. So in place of a co-presentation, we are just going to have one presenter representing the Yale contingent for this, and that's Mihailova, coming to us from Michigan State University, and she will begin things for us. So thank you.
I would like to first thank Ian and also Mickey and also Tim and basically everyone else who I am forgetting who came together to organize this event for Hannah. I think I speak for everyone who knew her and loved her when I say that this is very important to all of us to be able to be here together and celebrate her. She was very dear to me as a friend, and I will always have enormous respect for her as a colleague. So having a chance to pay tribute to her academic accomplishments is a privilege, honestly, and I'm very grateful to be able to do it. I am, however, deeply sad that I won't be able to share this speaker slot with John McKay as we originally planned, especially since he knew and also taught Hannah when she was at Yale, and I only met her later when we were both already in grad school, so I don't really speak to her Yale experience, unfortunately. And I know just how much John wanted to be here today and how much he regrets not being able to come, so through me, I'm sending his apologies to everyone. Unfortunately, he had surgery yesterday and was told that he cannot travel. Otherwise, he would have been here. So it's only just me today, and for this reason, I promise I won't take up the full 15 minutes, as much as I'm tempted to take up the full 90. So the title of this talk alludes to two goals that I have for tonight, but also for the rest of my academic career. First, I aim to single out some of Hannah's many contributions to animation pedagogy, and then offer some ideas on incorporating her research and her methodology into our own courses going forward. And I do mean all of us, I don't just mean the animation folks. Hannah's work is essential reading for any animation course, needless to say, but I think it's equally valuable and applicable to so many other topics as well. I chose to focus on pedagogy because even though most of us here are academics, Hannah was also a teacher in a way that gives the world meaning. Anyone who isn't sure of the difference should have seen her talk about pedagogy, or better yet, engage in it, and I hope some of you did. I will now most likely drive home the difference between the two by attempting to talk about pedagogy myself. So I will start with what I imagine Hannah would have liked me to start with, namely the cat in David Fincher's 2014 adaptation of Gone Girl. For a couple years, Hannah was deeply invested in this cat's ontological status and technological origins. A search of her Facebook updates reveals how the question of the cat progressed from 2015 to its spectacular climax 2 years later. Right here. So as you can see, hopefully, or probably not, I did not realize that the screen would be way over here. Anyways, some of you can see Hannah's claim that the cat in Gone Girl is computer-generated had become something of a running joke on social media. But then she made good on her promise to introduce this theory to the students in her special effects class, and the real magic happened. And as usual, the real magic happened on Reddit. So what you see here is a Reddit thread one of her students started on his or her own initiative in an attempt to once and for all resolve the debate about the cat's true nature. Allow me the pleasure of reading it out to you, especially those of you who can't see it. Our professor showed us a scene from Gone Girl and asked us to find a hidden special effect. The class collectively decided the cat was CGI, and the professor told us it was. We talked about it for an hour, and then the professor told us she had no idea if the cat was CGI and that she was lying. She then tasked us to find out. The credits revealed no animal wranglers or PETA being on set, etc. Further research gave me nothing. So I want to get other people's opinions and use that to formulate my discussion in class. Is the cat CGI? Question mark, end quote. Well, this is a metaphysical question for the ages. It is also a testament to the effectiveness of what I've come to lovingly think of as Hannah's signature pedagogical trolling. It is my favorite among her teaching tools because it is the only one I'm confident I already possess the skill set for. But while many people can troll, only someone like Hannah could take a cinematic object as seemingly insignificant as this cat, my apologies, and turn it into a case study of photorealistic CGI and our beliefs about its capabilities, as well as an exercise in research and even crowdsourcing information. So many of us are caught up in the act of projecting authority in the classroom that we wouldn't build an entire pedagogical exercise out of encouraging students to question us and the material we are presenting. But Hannah was also attuned to what makes students tick, and she knew that the challenge and the sting of being lied to would galvanize them and get them to really engage. And engage they did. So this continued for a while. This is only an excerpt of what was happening on Reddit. And what I love about it is that we see Hannah's student defending her methodology and explaining why it worked. The part that gets me every time, and I've reread this many times, I have to admit, is the sentence, "I think we have settled on mostly real, but we will discuss it again on Thursday." I think we all know how difficult it can be to sustain discussion for one class session, let alone have it carry over to the next meeting out of their own initiative. That Hannah got so much mileage out of a joke about a cat speaks to the power of pedagogical trolling done right and of her connection to her students. Hannah liked calling her own work process perverse. So I'm going to be a little perverse too. In addition to trolling, the second methodology of hers I want to celebrate is procrastination. I'm talking about the ease with which Hannah turned students' typical procrastination practices into creative learning experiences. She made me realize that the best way to guarantee that the students will actually do the assignment instead of messing around on the internet is to make sure that messing around on the internet is the assignment. In one of her animation courses, her students made quizzes and listicles on Buzzfeed and Playbuzz using material they learned in class. I think this is fantastic because it speaks directly to their daily habits as consumers of this type of online content. As you can see in this listicle description, which says 8 times when Disney frames were just as good as anything in an art museum. Yes, the language and format of Buzzfeed is something many of them are already versed in, for reasons that we all understand. This gives them a fun, familiar structure within which they can grapple with the material. The results Hannah shared were often very fascinating and also a little funny. The influence of her unique way of analyzing animation by closely reading each frame is clearly visible in the side-by-side comparisons that her student put here. And this is only 2 of them. There were about 10, I believe. It is easy to tell that this student has internalized her understanding of animation as more than simply movement and applied it in order to visualize the echoes between different painting traditions and the Disney classics. And here is a Playbuzz quiz dedicated to the work of ink and paint girls, the unsung heroes of cell animation labor that Hannah no doubt introduced her classes to for the first time. The entire quiz contains a number of questions just like the one over there, which essentially makes you count colors, and it made me doubt both my close analysis aptitude and my basic counting skills. It also made me appreciate the potential of this assignment to push students to not only mobilize their newly acquired knowledge, but also pay it forward by challenging others to do the same. The element of online sharing and play that such quizzes introduce beyond the classroom ensures that the assignment itself can become a pedagogical tool in its own right, as students take each other's quizzes and review the material in this way. And sometimes they can even inspire an actual ink and paint girl to come out of the woodwork and tell them off. So she said, essentially, that's not how we do it, or how we did it. I painted Tom and Jerry cartoons for Fred Quimby at MGM. The paint colors were assigned. I did not need to count colors to get the job. So if this isn't a sign that you're on the right track, I don't know what is. So my favorite thing about Hannah's pedagogy is the fact that she didn't simply ask her students to watch movies like the rest of us do. She asked them to stare at frames, as she put it. Here's an exchange between Hannah and Alla that I love because it shows how effortlessly Hannah's theory and practice overlapped all the time. If you can't make it out, Hannah explains that this assignment was to choose a single still frame, like the one pictured here from Pinocchio, and describe its salient elements in under 250 words, as a way of making sure students have absorbed relevant vocabulary. Studying animation frame by frame was Hannah's unique gift, both in the sense of talent and in the sense of an actual methodological and intellectual gift that I envy her students for having received at such an impressionable age. Hannah really put the close in close analysis. She always found the needle before the rest of us even saw the haystack. It's not just that she understood that there's more to animation than making things move. It's that she understood that each still image, each of those 24 single frames that make up 1 second of animated time, holds not only aesthetic value, but also the potential to unlock its own material history, and so much more besides, but only if you're willing to stare. Let me quote her since she explained it so elegantly. Each and every animated cartoon is a photographic archive, and each and every one of its frames can be understood as an individual photograph that preserves a moment in time. A reel of film, in this sense, is a record of its own making. Its constitutive frames double as a visual catalog of mistakes. And of course, blink and you will miss these errors. You must stop the film, look, stare. Treat the still frame as if it were a mugshot, end quote. This is from her piece titled Traces of the World, Cell Animation and Photography, published in Animation Interdisciplinary Journal in 2016. I wish I had time to talk about all of her work, but since I don't, I will briefly outline how I plan to incorporate this article in future courses. Needless to say, it will be a crucial addition to my traditional animation and history of animation courses, any that I design in the future. But most immediately next spring, I'm teaching film theory at U of M, and this article will be a lifesaver. Let me quote part of Hannah's abstract for the article in order to show you why. As she explains, the animated cartoon has traditionally been excluded from photographic theories of cinema, on the grounds that the animation camera is only incidental to the cartoon's production, an assumption this article challenges. Taking as its basic premise that all works of celluloid animation were photographic in origin, this article demonstrates the ways in which the physical reality of our world, and particularly the world of the animation studio, leaves its mark on the cartoon image, end quote. Teaching film theory as animation scholar can be a thankless task, precisely because of the contentious theoretical issue Hannah addresses here. Thanks to her article, correcting the theoretical sins of our past has become easier, and also a lot more fun. In Intro to Film, a class that pretty much all of us have to teach at some point, animation usually gets a week of course time, tops. Sometimes it gets grouped with experimental cinema. Sometimes it gets no coverage at all. This is partially the fault of the main introductory textbooks most of us use, which simultaneously sideline animation and utter it, presenting it as live-action cinema's quirky cousin that the rest of the family politely tolerates, then crops out of the Christmas card. As a result of this, Animation Week can often feel detached from the rest of the intro syllabus, despite an instructor's best efforts. I believe that Hannah's article, with its masterful reinscription of the animated cartoon within photographic theories of cinema, can bridge the distance that current canonical texts tend to create unnecessarily between animation and the so-called rest of cinema. And finally, this article will also shape how I teach close analysis going forward. The way I was taught close analysis of cinema and the way most students continue to be taught does not leave room for animation. And it certainly does not leave room for Hannah's meticulous, laborious, relentlessly dedicated attention. But I believe that her way of looking, as challenging as it is, teaches students the value of scholarly patience and discipline. And more importantly, I think it inspires them to want to actually discover things for the first time. So next time I'm teaching someone to analyze films, I will ask them not only to watch, but to look. Hannah's dissertation concludes as follows. Looking is laborious, but looking is also dreaming. Let us all keep looking and dreaming with Hannah and for her. Thank you.
So moving along from Yale to University of Iowa, next up we have two co-presenters, Corey Creekmur and Laura Cechanowicz.
It says here reserved, Corey Creekmur. I am rather reserved, but I thought I would tell you all that I'm nervous, thinking that that might dispel the nervousness. But then I realized to myself, I'm not nervous, but I'm feeling emotional. So bear with me. I'm a man who cries, so deal with it. Hannah came to the University of Iowa in 2009, where she continued to study Russian, which she had begun at Yale, while earning her MA degree in film studies in May 2010. Like a number of graduate students in cinematic arts at Iowa, she took advantage of the close interaction between the film studies and the film and video production programs by taking production courses alongside her advanced film history and film theory courses. As most of you will know, her work as an artist was as impressive and as fully intertwined with her work as a theorist, a trait that she shared with Sergei Eisenstein, to whom we shall return. No one will be surprised, I did a little homework, to learn that Hannah earned straight A's across her various courses, which included study with my colleagues Rick Altman, Paula Ahmad, Steve Cho, who is here, Leighton Pierce, Franklin Miller, and even, many of you knowing Hannah's politics won't be surprised, she studied with the prominent American labor historian Shel Stromquist. You'll hear soon from one of Hannah's graduate student colleagues. I'm very pleased to see that many of them are also here tonight, so I won't try to name check all of them, but I'm deeply pleased at the terrific showing of those colleagues. Like her friends and colleagues everywhere, the news of her death, especially brutal in its suddenness, which provided us no preparation for our loss, it shook us terribly in Iowa. Where we took immense pride in Hannah's subsequent success at the University of Chicago, to which many Iowa faculty, including myself, have ties. And as she launched her professional career as a professor in North Carolina, she was one of ours, even if we had to share her with some other pretty good schools and programs. And I know she's been mourned as deeply in Iowa City as in New Haven and in Chicago and Wilmington and elsewhere, including here, of course. Like other animation scholars, who are, in my mind, a very special breed, Hannah's rigorous work, which you've already heard a bit about, unprecedented for the revelations that it yielded through her frame-by-frame analysis. This work was built, it seems to me, upon a wonderful sense of play and fun, despite its rigor. French theorists would call it reverie. And also built upon a healthy recognition that she was simultaneously conducting pioneering research while getting away with a kind of version of playing with toys. Hannah's ability to not take herself too seriously while doing serious research was only one of her many unique abilities. All of you who know that she selected olive oil as one of her avatars have a good sense of how unseriously she might take herself. The work she was able to accomplish in far too little time was genuinely groundbreaking, and her presentation of it was dazzling. I don't think I'm speaking merely out of grief or out of nostalgia when I insist, I hope some of you shared this experience with me, that I insist that a couple of years ago she delivered one of the best presentations I have ever seen at SCMS. It was smart, it was witty, and it had examples that were perfectly and precisely timed. I'm sure if you asked Hannah how long her presentation was, she would have told you it was 19 minutes and 48 seconds. The small audience, this was late in the conference, surprised her by cheering wildly when she finished. It was more a performance piece than a lecture. It felt to me like you'd wandered into a sort of dingy bar on a Tuesday night, nobody's there, and then they announce, oh, and James Brown will be performing. I'm very grateful that I took the time to praise her for this at the time, rather than waiting to do so later, a later that will never arrive. As a teacher, you're probably not supposed to admit this, but it was clear to all of her former professors that Hannah simply stood out from her peers. As many have noted, including Tom Gunning, she was the kind of student who taught her teachers, even while you flattered yourself that you were supposedly guiding her. We were all looking forward to the amazing work we knew she would produce in a career that would soon change our understanding of any topic she took on. It's the loss of that promise, the brilliant work she would have produced for decades, that makes her passing so difficult for the field of film studies, while of course the personal loss faced by her family and her friends remains indescribable. In his curious, intriguing, often baffling notes on Walt Disney, Sergei Eisenstein claims, quote, "Disney's films, while not exposing sunspots, themselves act like reflections of sun rays and spots across the screen of the earth. They flash by, burn briefly, and are gone." Hannah was, of course, the ideal reader of Eisenstein's Disney essay, arriving a half-century after he struggled to help articulate that often cryptic, unfinished project. Whatever your religious beliefs, let's imagine that Hannah and Sergei are working through the essay together now and passing their funny and probably often naughty doodles back and forth. Eisenstein's deep appreciation of Disney can still surprise those who only know him as the exemplary communist filmmaker and the theorist and practitioner of dialectical montage. But Hannah seems to have divined the ways in which Mickey Mouse and Ivan the Terrible productively collided in his imagination. Like Disney's films, in Eisenstein's estimation, she also flashed by, burned briefly, and is gone. Despite our ongoing sorrow, we were lucky to witness her glow, and we might be forgiven if at times we mistook her for a star. Thank you.
I apologize if this is not precisely the length it should be. Could be a little bit longer. But so Hannah and I had an interesting relationship because we met in Iowa, where I was studying film studies, but I was also practicing as a filmmaker regularly. And I went on to pursue a PhD at USC after receiving my animation MFA in media arts and practice, which is an interdisciplinary half theory, half practice program. So that's my approach to Hannah and her work. It is remarkable for me that the last thing Hannah sent me was Joanna Kempner's Not Tonight in regards to women and pain, and whether or not their pain is taken seriously. Within her continued activity of collaging, colliding, what I'm really talking about here is montaging, material in life and work, she regularly contributed to so many of our lives by sharing ideas and inspiration. These scattered, fragmentary pieces, and I mean all of that as a compliment, also seem to uncannily echo the larger events of life at the time. What I want to focus on today is Hannah's method, and how it played out in her life and work, and how I see it playing forward. In every moment of life, when we move slowly from second to second, examining human life as frame-by-frame motion or stillness, we would do well to adopt Hannah's techniques and be certain to quietly notice and take pleasure in the small grandness of life. In those errors and aberrations between moments, we can see the unraveling of people working to make something perfect or flawless in the lifelong journey of a life. After all, at the end, we typically look back with a global lens. if you will, creating the briefest summaries of the grandest tales. Instead, I want to look again at the smallest moments. As Hannah puts it, imagine not watching a film but looking at it frame by frame. Bodies in motion would suddenly freeze, their irresistible sensuousness submitting to clinical scrutiny. Minute details in the photographic image would supplant the broader strokes of the film's narrative. The part would overwhelm the whole. But each of those fragments affords its own pleasures and hints at its own story. Something beautiful that she found. I just want to play this in the background while I continue. What is wonderful, and for me rather brilliant, about Hannah's use of Eisensteinian montage is the way she blended theory and practice to not only transmute the approach from film to a writing style and a theoretical analytical method of labor of analysis, to her comedic and insightful compulsion toward montage in her films and media experiments, from her longest short-form pieces to her GIFs, which, if you stare at them long enough, become another type of long form. As I have with this other one. I apologize for cutting this one short. This one is another favorite, and you'll note the quote. I've also been informed by John Krylan that in reviewing the bios of the Frankfurt School, he discovered that Hannah in her interests seems to have a lot in common with Walter Benjamin, quoted here. What I'm saying about Hannah is that her compulsion toward Eisensteinian montage was vigorously played out in her theoretical research on animation, in her animated films, and in her life, an ultimate, unlimited, animate masterpiece. This method of frame-by-frame analysis rings very true to the practice of animation. As an animator and scholar, but I'll focus on practice for now, I'll mention that during grad school and ever more beyond, we have always joked that life happens frame by frame. In other words, as one passes from non-animator to animator as practitioner, the way one learns to see is dramatically different as time slows and the motion between frames transfers from screen to life. Not only do we notice human motion with greater focus and study, but sometimes the moments seem to slow down as in slow motion, and it makes one wonder where the frames truly end and begin. It is no wonder to me, since Hannah loved and practiced animation from the earliest age, that she had an innately deep understanding of this. On a personal note, admittedly, in the same way in my mind as happens with good friends and colleagues, at times it is hard for me to locate the place in my thoughts where Hannah ends and I begin, to separate the part from the whole. For me, where I've been looking as a person with a disability and working on a PhD in theory and practice that deals narratively with invisible disabilities, I have learned once more that it is the tiniest moments that can not only define but save a life. It is the story that goes into each frame, the labor it takes to produce each moment of our lives, the labor of parents, of friends, in loving and supporting us as Hannah did so brilliantly for so many of us, and the labor of the moment itself, whatever materials move and animate within that frame. And here we find that which makes life. And as Jacob put it, Hannah reminded him to notice and appreciate each of these moments. More on that later. And Hannah went out of her way to make each frame as beautiful and miraculously present as feasible. The impact of living this way is that it truly gives life a remarkable presence. With more time, I would try to get into the wisdom of Hannah's approach as uniquely recognizing the neuroscience of human embodiment. Neuroscience providing a rich background for contemplating the ways in which our lives and experiences are engraved in the very material structure of our bodies, as much in the dust and the aberrations as in every moment, and the extent to which everything we do, from our smallest motions to our grandest gestures, is a buildup and collision of our past and present in one frame. And so, in an attempt to apply Hannah's approach to her time with us in Iowa, I would like to share a few small stories from some of the Iowa graduate students, glimpses into the small frames that in some way constitute a life. These are mostly from people who can't be here, and then a few of my own. From Allison McGuffey. I remember the first time Hannah pulled me aside to ask about my paper on Betty Boop. It was her first semester in the program, and I had barely met her. I was impressed with her open, friendly collegiality. She was so willing to collaborate on ideas and to help everyone. Also, I loved how perfectly she dressed as Minnie Mouse for one of our Halloween parties, and how she shared her justice-oriented Jewish traditions at her Hanukkah and Passover dinner parties. I want to briefly note that how this photo from the aforementioned party further exemplifies the manner in which Hannah pulled animation and her research into all elements of life. And from John Krylan, as evidence of how generous and encouraging a scholar and friend she was, I have to cite the volume of references and links to undersea-related things she sent me while I was dissertating. Many of these pertain to a planned but never realized chapter on underwater cell animation, things like a pic of Goofy as seen by a fish, and generally obscure cartoons such as Spellbound Hound, The Valiant Tailor, Pagan Moon, and less obscure Betty Boop's Lifeguard. Others were as wide-ranging as articles about cetacean speech, a 3-page excerpt from Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, and a video of dolphin farts. While probably none of this stuff made it into my final dissertation, it was hard not to think she was in my corner the whole time, and everything she sent me was on point in terms of the kind of material that excited me. And a second anecdote from John, touching deeply on the traces hidden within ourselves. And in his honor, I just want to play this, because he expressed he hopes this will continue going this way forever. So while I wrote my speech, I let it play as much as possible. Not long after her dad died, she told me that he and I had much in common, particularly our literary and musical tastes. It was a delight, thanks to Carter's hospitality, to be able to stay in that huge bedroom in Hoboken for a few nights in 2011 and comb through his books and bring some home with me. In Hannah's words, as many as you'd like, so leave some room in your suitcase. And from a combo of John Krylan and Luke Stadell, remembering their SCMS panel, it was a panel on audio vision. Luke spoke about TV sound, Hannah cartoon sound, a version of talk she gave at Iowa, and I whale sound recordings. That was from John. It has been reported that during this panel, which only a few very special people attended, several of them here in this room today, Luke Stadell wore a Macho Man t-shirt to the SCMS panel. So it is not a surprise, but a testament to Hannah's extreme attention to detail that she remembered this and sent him a Macho Man idol. Admittedly, Luke himself had forgotten wearing the shirt for the occasion. And Luke writes, "The Macho Man idol. A gift from Hannah Frank, which has guarded my primary workspace for the past 5 years, the only material remnant of our friendship. It will forever occupy a special place in my life." And from my own memories. Firstly, in my second animation course of my life, and our first digital animation course with Franklin Miller, Hannah and I spent many hours animating together on Wacom tablets in a windowless room in the bowels of the University of Iowa, where we birthed our respective short pieces. These also, to me, fully embody our embrace and amplification of the tiniest moments, as well as a shared appreciation for animals and the photographic image turned toward the animal, and later labored frame by frame. I wonder if I would have sustained all those hours without my friend by my side, and without knowing that she shared my labor in her own way. So while I relay a second story, I'll also play the rest of these. I think one of my proudest moments was when Hannah recalled for me the day we met. She remembered better than me, as my memory is terrible, and admittedly, to me it was fairly unremarkable. We'd all piled into an auditorium and went around the room introducing ourselves and our interests. At that time, I was pretty slim, I had blonde streaks in my hair, and for some reason, I just had a manicure. I then proceeded to explain my interests in experimental film and video, which shocked her overwhelmingly, as my visual composure did not seem to match. I can vividly remember her laugh and her head tilt as she retold this story for me, illuminating another angle on the same frame in a way that she consistently accomplished so brilliantly. Finally, in reviewing the magnum opus of my theory and practice research during my animation MFA, combining John Cage's approach to structure through visual scores with the neuroscience of embodiment by thinking through animating, Hannah's comment upon viewing my visual score was that her favorite part was when the paper dried, belying the photographed and physical nature of my painted frame. As I continue creating work on one piece of paper, I'll continue trying to collapse the life and the story of animation into one single piece of paper, one frame captured photographically, for me an ideal analogy to the human form, in which all of our history is inscribed in one material body. Hannah's work continues to inspire my own and my life to this end, as well as that of my colleagues, not only theoretically, but also in practice. My animation colleague, Amy Ketchum, and I recently spoke at the Animation Memory Conference in Nijmegen, before which I contacted Amy and connected her to Hannah so she could receive Hannah's dissertation. It was moving after Hannah passed away that Amy chose to include her in the Polaroid project, where fittingly she takes single frames from people's lives and memorializes them in labor-intensive cardboard recreations in the form of Polaroids. I did not tell her which image to pull. The project also includes animated Polaroids, but I think the etching of Hannah's image within this labor-intensive cardboard image, still frame, is an apropos memorial to her life and work. So what Hannah leaves me with prevailingly is a philosophy of writing, animating, and living. And since Jacob was as much a part of our experience in Iowa as many of the graduate students, I would love to conclude with this anecdote he shared with us on Hannah's Facebook. Last week, Goose and I took a walk at night, and she said, when I began to complain that I wasn't feeling well and needed to be at home, just stop for a moment, stand here under this live oak, hug me, and look up. This is what life is about. This isn't that tree, but it was one of my favorite Goose photos. She found enchantment everywhere and shared it far and wide.
My name is Robert Bird, and I was one of Hannah's teachers at the University of Chicago, which means one of her colleagues and, of course, one of her students. I had the privilege and joy of working relatively closely with Hannah from the moment of her arrival in Chicago in 2010 to her graduation in 2016. She arrived at a tough moment for our program. Suffice it to say that Miriam Hansen passed away during Hannah's first year. It is no exaggeration to say, in retrospect, that Hannah helped to sustain the department at its toughest moment, showing us all why we were there and what could still be done, and just how one might do it, with what intelligence, with what irony, with what grace. I want to say that Hannah was my best and most generous reader. This is what I most share, I think, with the faculty and students at the University of Chicago, many of whom are here tonight. I cherish all of her commentary as a precise index of her indomitable and playful spirit, which exemplifies her own major discovery, I think, this indexicality of even the most abstract images, even the most abstract ideas. We remained in touch as she moved to Wilmington. She sent me her tremendous article, The Potential of Pochta, which I was thrilled to assign my students of Russian cinema, write in manuscript form. And last summer, Joan Neuberger, Antonio Samaini, and I invited her to join a panel that we were organizing on Eisenstein's book, Non-Indifferent Nature. Hannah's proposal for this panel was one of the final things she wrote. It was and has remained unthinkable for us to remove her from the panel, and we'll begin tomorrow at noon by reading out her proposal. How can one commemorate Hannah? As we emerged from the initial shock, the department held an unforgettable celebration of her memory, featuring tributes in word, image, and of course cartoon and GIF and all the other formats that she worked in. Campus events were led by the graduate students who have spearheaded the event tonight, and I want to note their selfless and untiring efforts to provide us with ways and opportunities to celebrate Hannah properly, and to thank them for inviting me to represent the university at this commemoration. I feel inadequate to the task. I have no privileged point of view. There was so much I did not know, did not even see, what I learned about only during the commemorations. It's the only reason I regret not having been on Facebook all these years. It seems to me in retrospect that Hannah single-handedly has justified the medium. But as I just considered how best to memorialize her this evening, I couldn't quite get beyond this paper proposal, which crystallizes her interests and talents in such a familiar and completely inimitable fashion. She was proposing, it was called Unbridling the Imagination, Eisenstein on Animation in Theory and Practice. And she would begin with Eisenstein's writings on Disney and investigate, as she writes, what Eisenstein's theory meant in practice. What would a truly Eisensteinian animated cartoon look like? Now, Hannah, as already has been noted, was uniquely placed to imagine this, having such an Eisensteinian mind and a Disney imagination. To answer the question, Hannah looks, and I quote further, to an hitherto untranslated chapter from the Russian text of Sergei Eisenstein's non-indifferent nature, The Spotted Little Horse, thus unbridled imagination, in which Eisenstein provides a treatment for an animated film. The premise for the film may seem simple. It follows the adventures of the red and green dapples on a clay horse figurine as they leap off the body of the toy and proceed to take a life of their own. But it is firmly anchored in Eisenstein's theories of color, comedy, and ecstasy. Hannah left us with so little of what she had to give us, but it is so much. She left our Eisenstein panel with a brief proposal for this paper. It is so little and so much. Her husband, Jacob, has sent me the first draft of a translation that Hannah was making of Eisenstein's text, and it helps us to understand what she was thinking and to imagine better what we have lost. And I imagine that Hannah would have ended up rendering Eisenstein's vision not only as a paper for our panel, but also as a short animated film, a film that she did not leave us. And I wish I were able to do it now. I seriously considered trying to learn the practice of animation for this purpose, but was unable to do it. But I would ask you to imagine the film as I read the beginning of Eisenstein's screenplay. To help you, here are some toys of the kind that Eisenstein was writing about from Eisenstein's study. This is a slide courtesy of Naum Kleiman, and it includes the milkmaids and nursemaids that Eisenstein discusses. We no longer have the Vyatka, the horse itself. These are toys from a town or an area in Russia called Vyatka. These are contemporary, more industrial, I think, industrially produced versions of them. We have a horse on the right and a milkmaid in the center. And here's the closest I've been able to find to the figure that Eisenstein is talking about, where we have a horse with a maiden on it. And so, these are the maids from Eisenstein's study, and here then is a composite version. We have the milkmaid, or the nursemaid on the right, the horse in the middle, and a goat whistle on the left. So, the Vyatka horse, a screenplay by Sergei Eisenstein. A Vyatka toy in the shape of a small aerodynamic white horsey with red and green apples winks at us from the shelf, where it carries on its back a girl in a neon pink dress standing between a two-headed goat whistle and a nursemaid in a sundress. Suddenly, a colorful swirl of green and red circles from its dapples escapes from the bounds of its contours. Now they, chasing one another, rush onto the white canvas of the screen. The green and red apples fly. Along the way, they encounter the sundress of their neighbor, the nursemaid. It is a checkered gingham with fat yellow stripes intersected by blue. Bam, 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 ba-ba-bam. The green and red dots play a game of tic-tac-toe in the yellow-blue crosses of the sundress. Bam, a red dot is placed. Bam, a green one, another red, another green, red. The nursemaid doesn't have time to come to her senses, and already, bam, a straight line from one corner to the other crosses out the multicolored dress, pronging 3 red dots. Greens have missed out. They are not laid out in their little squares. They have given the reds space in one line to win. Boom, boom, boom. Greens prepare to exact revenge, but the gleeful reds outsmart them. This time they line up from the belt of the nursemaid to the hem, and now all the dots, both green and red, tire of galloping lengthwise and across the sundress. The landscape beckons, and now, chasing one another, the kaleidoscope of their wheel rolls to the rippling contour of a hill on the horizon. It goes on for many, many pages. But this beginning of the screenplay, this beginning of this film that no doubt existed in Hannah's imagination, reminds us of her fascination with moments where the animated world was rendered in the idiom of abstract painting. In her paper, she would go on to build on Tom Klein's documentation of Eisenstein's influence on Seamus Culhane, especially in the Woody Woodpecker cartoon, The Loose Nut. And then Hannah proposed to look for Eisensteinian resolutions of color in the work of other animators like Frank Tashlin. I've looked through and I note, for example, the discourse on color in The Fox and the Grapes, which turns into this color rhapsody. But the cartoon that I've found that gives me the closest sense of what Eisenstein was imagining maybe was Drafty Daffy by Truck Jones, 1945, in which Daffy Duck tries to escape an army inspector who has come to deliver the induction papers. As he zips up and down the stairs, Daffy's body resolves into a swirl of colored dots. In the finale, Daffy resorts to a rocket. Here he is. Here's our rocket, sorry. A rocket that crashes into a semblance of a Kandinsky painting circa 1915. One can imagine the historical dimension of Hannah's project. One can imagine her looking at moments where abstract art converged with satire in children's literature. L. Lisitsky's legendary children's book about the adventures of two squares, for example. Hannah would have turned her thoughts not only to abstraction, but also to the peculiar materiality of the toy, the labor of its production, the contingencies of its preservation, the kitschy quality in its cheap contemporary renditions. And in doing so, she would certainly have cited Walter Benjamin's description of similar toys during his visit to Moscow in late 1926 and early 1927. Benjamin wrote in his essay, Russian Toys, "The robust rural expression of these dolls from the Vyatka district stands in contrast to their highly fragile condition. They have nevertheless survived the long journey, and it is good that they have found a safe asylum in the Moscow Museum, for who knows how long even this kind of folk art can withstand the triumphant progress of technology which today sweeps across Russia. Already the demand for these things has supposedly died, at least in the cities, but in the farmhouse the clay is still needed at day's end, painting with glowing colors and fired. In their homeland, surely, these toys still live on." And thinking about animation in these handmade toys, she would have thought, drawn on Benjamin, on their form. The horse, which is still visible, has merged with, in one model on the left, has merged with the man on the one next to it. Demotic toys strive for simplified forms. She would have been led to consider Benjamin and plasmaticness. But more important than this genealogy, she would have extended her argument about Eisenstein in mid-century animation to developments that lay in the future, avant-garde cinema of the 1960s and beyond into our own day. She left us with these fragments, these elements of an article, a book, a world that we have only as fragments. And we can imagine how they would come together, and it is our duty, I think, to do so gratefully, since Hannah has opened our eyes to these connections and countless other ones. We cannot hope to do so with anything like Hannah's inimitable panache, and we will never know the unexpected twists that Hannah would have discovered, perhaps in short films and animations of her own. We have lost so much, and faced with our own inadequacy in the face of this loss, I speak for our entire community when I thank you for this opportunity to unite this evening in celebration of what she has left us.
All right, thank you, Robert. We end the career retrospective portion of the evening with Tim Palmer of University of North Carolina.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for having me here. I'm happy to be here. I'm also desperately sad to be here as well. I am a professor at UNC Wilmington, and I'm here to try to represent a little bit of the too brief time that we had Hannah, and Hannah was my colleague down there. I feel a little like an interloper in a way, in that I only knew Hannah from 2016 onwards. My first interaction with Hannah was actually to be on the phone with her. I was part of the job search committee that brought her to the UNC Wilmington. I think in hindsight, this was maybe one of the smartest things I ever did, but it was also such a no-brainer. Right from the beginning, Hannah just leapt off the page, her cover letter, her CV. This was someone we wanted to know, to meet, and to work with. My first semester interacting with Hannah, we were overlapping our teaching schedules. This was the fall of 2016, and we would interact and intersect over the photocopier in the center of King Hall, where our film studies department is. Typically, Hannah would be printing out something bizarre. She'd be photocopying something very strange, and I would look over the shoulder, and we would talk about what we were going to be doing that day. Our conversations would broaden from there. We would talk about our passions for esoteric things. I would talk about weird things from 1920s French cinema that I'd come across. Typically, Hannah would say, "That sounds really interesting. You'll have to give me a clip of that. I really want to see that film you've just been describing." The conversations broaden. We would end up talking about things like the habits of our felines. Our friendly rivalry grew to be who had the strangest cats. Those who knew Hannah knew her passion for Ingeborg, and I think she won that rivalry about who had the oddest cat. My work here today, though, is to commemorate and to bring something else, and I hope contribute to our remembering of Hannah, which is to talk about the undergraduates that she interacted with in her short time at UNCW. When we first lost Hannah and I first started to float the idea to the students, I actually took over her senior seminar midway through the semester, which was very difficult. But I said to my students, I've had this invitation and I've been asked to come and talk about Hannah, and I thought maybe the best thing I could do would be to talk about you and your experiences here. And I was a little bit wary almost to start with about, do I have a right to be the ambassador for your views and your remembrances? And they were very fierce right from the start. It's like, no, we want you to go and talk about Hannah. We want you to be this conduit for us. So that's what I want to do here today. I have 3 remembrances in particular. Another formal professional interaction I had with Hannah was again in the fall of 2016 when I was assigned to go and assess her teaching. This is the job we all have to do when a junior colleague comes in, right? We go to visit the classroom, we sit down, we see them in action, we maybe give them some feedback, some pointers. I remembered that day as I went into the classroom with Hannah's survey class of animation. I remembered my great aunt, Mew, who when I was a very small boy growing up in England would take me to see pantomimes. And I remember one day I saw her and she was looking the other way. She wasn't looking at what was going on screen. Those who know English pantomimes know this is a rather raucous activity, but she was looking the other way. And I remember asking her, "Why are you looking? You're looking at the audience." And she said, "Watching the audience is often just as fun as watching the actual performance." And I realized to do this with my teaching evaluations. I was look at the room. What are the undergraduates doing? And I remember one of the first things I spotted was Hannah's students were, it's a cliche, but they were literally on the edge of their seats with her. I remember actually during the class itself, I believe one of the students actually fell off his chair. He was so just enthused, to put it mildly, about what she was doing. It's that great dynamic you see when you see brilliance in teaching, which was that idea of you put things in play, you're an ambassador for whatever you're teaching, whatever you're discussing, and at a certain point, hopefully, if all goes well, those students start to think, these are my things, my materials. I have a stake in this. I'm excited by this. And she would ask questions. The hands would go up, a couple of hands. And literally, at one point in the room, she asked a question, and every single student put their hand up. I don't think I've ever seen this before. By the end of the session, the students were almost finishing her sentences for her. They were so invested in the materials. I had my wonderful young son with me at the time, and I noticed midway through that he had his hand up too. He was so desperate to contribute, and that was the mood in the room. Anyway, teaching can be a wonderful thing. It can also be an ephemeral thing. But I have, among many, offered testimonials, 3 in particular that I'd like to share with you today. We had a commemoration for Hannah in Wilmington, and honestly, among all the wonderful tributes we had, I think the undergraduates' testimonials may have been the best, the most sincere, the most moving, and the most, in certain ways, summed up the time we had with Hannah. She made an amazing impact in only just a year. So this is Savan to start with. I have 3 of these. He says, Dr. Frank was to me more than a professor. She was a mentor. She was someone who challenged me to think critically, to create art. And though on the surface she was quiet, her intellect roared with a ferocity. It's a nice line, roared with a ferocity that I'd hitherto never experienced. Her kindness and generosity thundered through these halls, touching all who knew her, perhaps even those who didn't. Through her soft voice, sips of water, and voice cracks, she spoke with a volume I could only envy. I'm reminded of a homework assignment she assigned in her Russian and Soviet cinema course. The assignment was to describe the effects of repetition on one's perception of time. I, thinking myself a genius, replied with the sentence, repetition slows my perception of time 42 times. She replied, informing me that my post took her less time to read than her classmates, and wrote a repetitive paragraph of her own, discreetly altering and rearranging words, arresting the reader's attention in a way mine never could. This was her brilliance. I'm also reminded of the way she inspired me to break the rules, her rules. I met with her to discuss the final paper guidelines, and Dr. Frank, knowing my love of Tarkovsky, encouraged me to eschew the standard guidelines and to do something completely different. She asked if I'd be interested in structuring my paper like the film Mirror. She asked me to create art. And when I hesitated, she smiled at me. The students all remember Hannah's smile. This came up in all the testimonials, the flow of them I got over the course of the past year. When I check my email, there'll no doubt be more of them waiting for me. They all talk about that wonderful trademark smile of hers. Gave me the okay sign and said, "You got the chops." We've heard lots of academic quotations from Hannah's work. There's another one from the undergraduate perspective. You got the chops. She made her students feel unique. She fostered an environment that allowed me to open up to her in ways I only did to my closest friends and family. This was her brilliance. All of these things are what made her such a beautiful person. She will linger on in her distinguished scholarly work, the friendship she cultivated, and perhaps most importantly, in the young artists she taught and influenced. May she be reflected in the works of all those who knew her. My second is from a student called Mandy. She was in the seminar I took over, and for a long time she said, I don't really feel like I have the words to sum up my interactions with Hannah. She took every class possible in all the 3 semesters. We were lucky enough to have Hannah at the UNCW. This is what she sent me just recently. Hannah taught my history of Soviet cinema class last semester, and I absolutely adored her. This was another key word that came up in the students. They adored her. I'd never taken a class with her before and was not sure what to expect, as on the first day she seemed very reserved. I was, however, blown away by her intelligence and humor as the semester progressed. They all remember the humor, and walked away with new favorite films, even though I had little to no interest in the subject going in. She always surprised me. I was shocked to discover that she was only a couple of years older than I, and it has put a lot of perspective for me. I was excited to see what was in store for us in digital cinema, and had already enjoyed the few films she had shown us in these first 2 weeks. On that note, Hannah was able to get me to appreciate so many aspects of Soviet cinema. I knew she had a passion for the animation and an affection for the bizarre. This was another recurring refrain of the undergraduates, an affection for the bizarre. I think that's quite nice. I am not very good at these sorts of things, Mandy continues, but I hope it can still be helpful. Finally, some words from Caitlin. Caitlin stands out, but in certain ways doesn't stand out because she was one of the actually quite high number of students who I know personally stayed in college because of Hannah. We remember, we mourn her in all sorts of ways, but that goal we have in teaching to change lives, to make people's lives better coming on behind us, there are many students who graduated or are going to graduate literally because of the year and a bit we had Hannah. Caitlin says, I got to know Dr. Hannah Frank last spring in my senior year at UNCW. I had the pleasure of being in 2 of her classes, History of Russian and Soviet Cinema and Special Effects Senior Seminar. My first impression of Dr. Frank was that she was eccentric, exceptionally intelligent, and good-hearted. She was passionate in her teachings, another key word that came up a lot, passionate. And she genuinely cared for all her students. In the beginning, she seemed serious, but I came to learn that she also possessed a remarkable sense of the humor that illuminated the room. Part of her humor was her mischievousness. In particular, she loved provoking a wild reaction and then continuing on with her lecture as though nothing unusual had happened. Meanwhile, I and many of my peers would be in pieces for hours afterwards. One of the first times this happened was in the history of Russian and Soviet cinema. During one of her lectures, in fact, she introduced Thomas Edison's talking doll from 1890. She took the time to show us various write-ups and photos of the doll. Finally, she concluded with something like this. Isn't it amazing to experience something decades of years old that no one could hear until now? Are you ready? We were in the heart of a 3.5-hour lecture, and it took me a moment to realize what she had planned. She then pulled up the audio clips on the screen, and ignoring the class's protests, she hit play. What followed was the food of nightmares, and those of you who've heard Thomas Edison's dolls know what Caitlin is talking about. It generally is indelible, once heard, never unheard. A shrieking rendition of Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep filled the room. I nearly dropped out of my seat, again with the falling out of the seat. But she continued to play another one. And here's where Caitlin takes a serious turn. My most important memory of Dr. Frank is the first time I visited her office. My depression and anxiety had risen to a degree where I could not function. I missed her classes for about 2 weeks. I was quietly falling apart and giving up in several senses of the word. During our meeting, I just cried, but I did not need to explain myself because she understood well. This is another of the refrains, Hannah's empathy. She said to me that she had gone through herself similar problems in college. She said she would do anything in her power to see me graduate. I did graduate in May, and she was one of the first ones to hug me on stage on graduation day. Caitlin concludes, aside from her academic teachings, she has affected me in many ways. Because of Dr. Frank, I am immediately put on edge if someone uses CGI and cat, we've already heard about that, in the same context. I'm unable to see cow's milk without thinking of the film Old New by Sergei Eisenstein. I will probably name a cat Ingeborg at some point of my life, and I will never take the beauty in this world for granted. The end of my speech, Caitlin's speech, my speech now, is for Dr. Frank. Dr. Frank, thank you for inspiring me and for being unashamedly you. Thank you for being my professor and friend. This is how Hannah was remembered, and this is who Hannah was in such a terribly short time. She was for our students a professor and a friend. Thank you.
Yes, so thanks once again to Ian and to the rest of, especially the UChicago folks for putting this together on a very short window of time. What we're going to try to do is just gesture towards some of what Hannah's very specific and very infectious way of looking at things has meant to us and what we think it might mean in the future. We're going to do it by positing what we are going to call the Frankish frame. And by that, we mean any frame that demands to be seen independently of its place in a phase of motion. So locating a Frankish frame takes work. You have to fight eye fatigue. You have to fight boredom. A Frankish frame is also evidence of work of the camera operator, of the inker, of the painter. Once isolated, this frame in Hannah's work tends to prompt two kinds of speculation. The first is a historical one. What is that speck or blotch, and how did it get there? What kinds of stories might we tell to account for it? Is that cat CGI? The second kind of speculation tends to be counterfactual. What if we looked at cells or frames like documents on microform? What if an entire cartoon were made up of single frame abstractions or motion blurs? What if I troll my students about this cat? So what follows are some Frankish frames. A few of them are from her own work. More often, these are frames that Alla and I have found, frames that we found ourselves prompted to look at through her eyes.
There on the right, a Frankish frame caught and fixed in Hannah's dissertation, a macabre hair-raising frame in hair-raising hair. Bugs Bunny pounds on a door, turns to the audience for help, and for a single frame, he loses his head. Just like that, Hannah writes, we realize he has been painted in sections, his head on one cell and his body on another, and we see both the total coherence of Bugs's graphic design and the completely fragmented labor process that necessitated dividing him across numerous cells. For Hannah the detective, such accidental frames, such incidental frames, are evidence of animation's place in a photographic theory of cinema, perhaps the central place as the art form that captures the materiality of cinema itself. Here, a group of Frankish frames from 4 cartoons spanning 3 decades of studio production. In a single moment of extreme dynamism, an explosion, a fight, an eruption of a storm, the cartoon charges past the limits of representation and figuration and bursts into pure abstraction. At SCMS last year, Hannah presented a montage of stroboscopic effects and flickering frames she culled from decades of cartoons dating back to the 1920s, framing them as a pioneering history of structural film within studio animation. Each frame like this might seem unremarkable when it rushes past us in the flow of the film, and yet it becomes exceptional in its arrested and arresting significance. She writes about such a frame, "It may in the flow of the action go unnoticed, but in isolation it is too puzzling, too wonderful, and often too abstract to be ignored. Perhaps it is the flurry of brushstrokes that seizes one's attention, or perhaps one is seduced by its radical minimalism or overwhelmed by its cacophonous colors."
So in examining this skeleton dance a few weeks ago, while just kind of looking for cycles, I noticed this, a misplaced frame in a 4-frame cycle. It's mistakenly taken from a previous cycle in the film. Here, the frame of animation becomes a filing error, but we can say little about what caused it. How were these cycles arranged? Were they in stacks? Had the camera operator grabbed one frame from the wrong stack? Had this errant frame been somehow misplaced onto that stack? Hannah writes, quote, "There is a limit to what the photograph alone can show, yet the pursuit of that limit itself constitutes a form of aesthetic experience." A little bit later, I saw this, a skull on which the eyes, nose, and mouth have not been inked, as a result of which the skull has basically lost its 3-dimensionality. The repetition of the task of inking frames is revealed here, though again, we don't know what caused this error. Static electricity sticking cells together, frustration, reverie? Did the inker hope that the camera operator wouldn't notice? Did the inker hope that anyone would notice? The point here, as with most of these epistemological knots into which Hannah ties herself, is that the closer we look, the less we know. But the less we know, the more closely we are prompted to look.
Look, the Frankish frame is one that exposes the tension between the handiwork and mechanical reproduction in animation. Look here, through 2 comparative frames, Hannah tackles the role of the Xerox in changing the aesthetics of Disney studio animation, Cinderella's stepmother and Cruella de Vil. Compare the lines marking the women's hair, contouring their faces, signaling their wrinkled foreheads. This period marks a transition from using human labor to transfer animators' drawings to celluloid sheets in the ink and paint department, toward using the Xerox copier to directly transfer drawn outlines from the animator's work on paper to cells. Hannah discovers here a paradox in how handiwork functions in animation. The inked and painted lines on a stepmother are made by human hands, but the goal of the process is to eliminate any traces of human error. The line is made crisp, clean, sterile, invisible. The handiwork of the ink and paint women is automatized. Conversely, the Xerox line on Cruella is made by mechanical reproduction, but here it promises to preserve the looseness, hesitation, roughness, fluidity of the animator's hands. I've been thinking a lot about the role of painstaking manual reproduction in the direct animation filmmaking method, a method often called cameraless animation generated directly on the celluloid film strip. Direct animation is so often romanticized for stripping down the mechanism of cinema to its naked essentials and allowing for a direct bodily connection between the maker and the film. This view of direct animation places it in a tradition of abstract expressionist painting and surrealist doodling practices. And Hannah's work reminds us this ignores the stark difference between producing a single canvas and thousands of canvases. Above are 6 frames from Len Lai's hand-scratched free radicals. These frames are from the film's title as it bounces on screen. Hannah's appeal for nuance in our discussion of handiwork in animation, what sort of handiwork we value or ignore, has been vital in helping me explore gestural automation and repetition in independent animation.
Hannah's attention to language is something I have admired a lot, and one particularly enabling metaphor that she sometimes uses to describe cartoon work is textiles. The frame or cell is like a fold or swatch of fabric, made more or less anonymously, its shape predetermined by a template, but still exhibiting a faint signature of facture that can be studied as a graphic or tactile pattern in its own right. If the women of the Cartoon Studio ink and paint departments are, as she writes, heirs to, quote, women of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and the cotton mills of Lawrence, Massachusetts, end quote, they might also be the progenitors to contemporary animator Jody Mack's frame-by-frame studies of color printing and fabric patterns.
In reviewing frames one at a time, Hannah often spots and recognizes intertextual allusions in the backgrounds and corners, brief flickers which seem to exist for nobody but the animators themselves, or perhaps for an imagined future viewer who loves and studies these frames with singular dedication. Her Facebook timeline, which appears in so many conversations, generously shares snapshots of her startling observations, many of which hint at what she's working on at the time. The 4 images grouped on her left are one of her last posts. In them, she assembles 3 iterations of a George Braque still life with fruit, the one in top left, alongside 3 backgrounds from Chuck Jones's Looney Tunes short House Hunting Mice. The other 3 are the 3 iterations of the painting found in the film. We might just guess what these 3 Frankish frames reveal for her. A mutual relationship between high art and low cartoon culture, sure, but also the curious implications of this manual reproduction of a work of art. This image is deliberately reworked by the artists in the film, not once, but 3 different times in 3 different iterations, instead of just copying one, with sufficient faithfulness to maintain some sort of signature of the original, and yet enough departure to deliberately announce itself as a copy. When I try to date and title the Braque painting that Hannah has recognized, I run into the challenge of locating the precise still life that is cited in this film. I realize, as Hannah must have, that Braque's own painting is itself a post-war reiteration, made in 1949, of numerous earlier iterations made on one theme, 20 years of him unfaithfully reworking his own composition, itself an unfaithful reworking of a classic naturalistic motif. Inspired by Hannah's finds, I challenge my animation history students, many of whom are also animation majors, to pay attention to the backgrounds in the shows they're watching, pausing to reflect on everything from wallpapers and prop design to texture mapping choices. My students are so excited about the idea of detective work, but not the tedious labor. The results, however, prove rewarding. For example, one of my students who watches the popular Emirati animated series Frige spots a number of tongue-in-cheek references to Western imported products, from cereal boxes to artworks. The most interesting for her is a background painting of Mona Lisa that appears in only one scene. Upon enlarged close-up, Mona Lisa is revealed to be garbed in a traditional niqab face mask, like all the central characters on the show. Is this a loving homage to a canonical work of Renaissance art, alongside a subtle jab made by the animators at conservative Islamic standards of modesty? Or, by covering the most notable feature of Mona Lisa's face, her famous smile, while still maintaining her recognizability, is the show gesturing towards its own choice to feature characters with covered mouths, a decision that saves an enormous amount of labor, but also proudly defies accepted wisdoms in animated character design. For my student, a Syrian-Canadian artist, this becomes an opportunity to question her own aesthetic choices in accepting a lot of wisdom of how one must animate.
So while looking at a couple of stills from Hannah's dissertation, which you see on the bottom there, I was immediately reminded of the image on the top, a mole hair that she has rotoscoped from Danny Lee's face in John Woo's film The Killer for her video making a movie out of a mole hair, which is exactly what it sounds like. The jagged texture of the line is deliberate. It changes with every frame of the video. Is the echo of these frames also deliberate? Was she thinking of those frames when she drew this? Did those frames impress themselves as a graphic pattern that is simply used later without recalling its sources? Or did she draw this before she ever found those frames? Where we don't know, we can play.
The player of the Frankish frame seeks affinities and differences in the surface of the image, the qualities of the graphic that connect or separate it from its immediate or historic neighbors. The spectator is neither passive nor pensive, but perceptive, alert, detecting. The game of connecting frames across genres and time periods by graphic affinity becomes a kind of historiographic overtonal montage. In one of her most recent posts, Hannah uploads a blurry enlargement of another painted reproduction in House Hunting Mice and asks for help in identifying its intended original referent. I return to it frequently and keep trying to solve the puzzle. I try to automate this game. I slightly clean up the noise and then ask Google image search to locate compatible lookalikes through its internal pattern recognition. Cartoon is the algorithm's best guess, but it has no other answer for me, just hundreds of lookalikes. The single frame suddenly reanimated by the archive.
Here is an 8-frame hold from, yet again, The Skeleton Dance. In the context of the film, this takes up less than half a second, but viewed one frame at a time, a new aesthetic experience emerges. We might ask then, in the spirit of Hannah's own what-if thought experiments, as well as her videographic work, what if an entire film consisted only of holds? What would we see? So this is just a brief clip that tries to think through that what-if question by playing with the tempo of some of these frames. The figures effectively become wallpaper, and new, unshaped movements become visible. The lighting flickers. Bits of detritus pop up and vanish. Lint, dust, dead skin cells, we don't know for sure. The cell itself bends outward and then settles down again.
To conclude by expanding on a quote from Hannah's dissertation that already appears today. We work at watching animation in order that we might play. We scan the deep focus composition in order to find Cinderella, and in the process, take in its sumptuous blues and pinks, the shadows that have been painted and the shadows that have been photographed, the three-dimensionality of 2 dimensions. Looking is laborious, but looking is also dreaming. Thank you.
Well, unlike the other guests, and as a testament to my sense of honor to be included, I actually didn't know Hannah Frank. I met her a few times. We had a kind of informal mentor-mentee relationship. We had coffee at a coffee shop in Chicago a couple of times. She was working on her dissertation at the time. I really don't remember much about the content of it, but I know that we talked about our mutual interest in the notion of animation as a kind of performance art. And also there was a kind of interesting coincidence in our trajectories, both from Yale, both from Iowa, and then my friendly connections to the University of Chicago over the years. So that's about the extent of our personal relationship. My interest in Hannah really is academic and intellectual. And it stems mainly from her dissertation. And as you already know, and we've had reiterated, her interest was in examining the glitches, the pentimenti, the Easter eggs left in these works by the people who created them, and looking at the connection to labor and the artisan and the artist's handiwork as it went on. Just to give you another example of the kind of work that she was interested in, she has numerous examples that build up on these key words, and this is one
area in the introduction to the thesis, where she talks about traces, brushwork, handiwork. I can't actually read it on either of my screens, but I remember it pretty well. And it's the leitmotif of Frank's work that motivates and electrifies her research. So here's a typical example from the thesis. This is Lonesome Ghost, a Disney film from 1937. And thanks to Alla and Ryan, we now have a vocabulary to describe these effects. These are Frankish frames that Hannah was able to recuperate from her close, frame-by-frame, forensic viewing, slow viewing of this film. And you can see that there is actually no Mickey Mouse in any of these frames. It's just painted blur and some of those abstractions that the other speakers have talked about. So my interest tonight is to essentially apply the scientific method and look at Hannah Frank's work as a kind of database and ask the question, can it be replicated? Can we build on it to further test the limits and the possibilities? So a good candidate for this, I would offer to you, are the films of the Swiss animator Georges Schwitzgebel. He's not that all well known. The animation community will know him well, but I think he's the most important animator you've never heard of right now. And what I'd like to do is show Schwitzgebel's most recent film called The Battle of San Romano. It's 2 minutes, and I was intrigued to hear about Hannah's multiple choice question from Misha. So I'd like to offer, in the spirit of Professor Frank, the same test. So I'm going to show this film. It's actually 2 minutes and 20 seconds. And it was filmed on a 35 millimeter film at 24 frames per second. So my question for you is, how many drawings, although they're actually paintings, how many graphic works were required to make this film? Now, put your smartphones away. There's no cheating. And if you already know the answer, keep it to yourself until after the film, please. So, and if we could turn the lights all the way down, I don't know if that's a possibility or not.
The sound is fading to the projector.
Okay.
If you want to redirect it to the speaker to redo the presentation, is it fine?
I think it'll be okay.
Okay.
It's only 2 minutes. Thanks. Okay, Ian. So how many say more than 5,000? Okay, show of hands. How many say between 1,000 and 5,000? Okay. How many say around 500? Okay. You voted twice. I saw that. Okay, the answer to the question is 36. So here's the Swiss animation historian Roland Coulsondet standing in front of some of the paintings on display at an art gallery in Vevey. It's an extremely complicated technique, and if one were to apply forensic viewing or slow viewing to this, eventually I think one would figure it out by a kind of reverse engineering. What is going on here is that Schwitzgebel is using several classic animation techniques from the studio period, especially cycling, but also refielding and applying changes to the painting as it progresses. I don't have time to go into the detail, but one would intuit and probably find with some empirical research the actual planning that goes into making one of Schwitzgebel's films, which are extraordinarily labor intensive.